BBC News at 7 o'clock. Downing Street has rejected Labour demands for Parliament to be recalled to discuss the future of the British steel industry. Tata Steel, which has announced plans to sell its UK operations, says it will start looking for potential buyers, but has warned that the process can't be open-ended. The Business Secretary, Sajid Javid, is returning early from a trade visit to Australia to deal with the crisis. The Director General of the free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, Mark Littlewood, said the government would be foolish to intervene.
Steel is no longer, I'm afraid to say, a strategic industry for the United Kingdom. I'm very sorry for the people whose jobs are at stake. It's a local tragedy and a personal tragedy, but we can't have this nonsense about bailing out businesses that are failing and recalling Parliament every time a number of thousands of jobs are at risk.
The decision not to prosecute any individual police officer.
So last year I finished a paper with that example, which is extraordinary if you think about it for more than a few seconds. Here is the BBC 7 o'clock news on March the 16th last year, 2016. It's dealing with a major potential employment crisis, an issue which has got profound implications for the way in which we organise our economy. It threatens more than one community in the UK, and it's Mark Littlewood of the Institute of Economic Affairs who is allowed to frame that short clip. The news bulletin at 7 o'clock only lasts for a couple of minutes. Here's Mark Littlewood framing the way in which we should understand that economic crisis. So that's more or less where I finished a paper on think tanks a year ago, and I'm going to pick it up from there. So what I want to do is to suggest that there are some ways in which we can begin to answer the question, how on earth did Mark Littlewood, this kind of human oil well, slimy, creepy guy, how on earth is he allowed to bookend the news? How does that happen? So I'm going to start by considering some theoretical themes and debates before exploring the history of Britain's neoliberal think tanks. Very briefly, I think I'll edit that. And the ways in which this history informs their media strategies, I'll include that. And then finally, the paper is going to report on some empirical research which sheds light on the relative success of these strategies. Now, what I want to do first is just to go back some very, very old stuff, but suggest that it's actually quite relevant still. So, although Gramsci's concept of hegemony might be said to be one of the cornerstones of media studies and cultural studies in the Western Academy, his actual writing on the tactics and strategy of ideological struggle have been rather neglected in recent years. But recently there are signs of a revival of interest in the specifics of the prison notebooks, beyond the generic concept of hegemonic struggle. In part, this has been prompted by those seeking ways of reconciling a Gramscian analysis of the relationship between power and language with Foucault, i.e. recent book, edited collection by Krebs. There's another book by Ives and a couple of other people. However, for those critics who are not satisfied by an analysis based only on text and discourse, like Greg Philo, I don't know if anybody's read Greg Philo's article in Journalism Studies about 5 years ago, in which he sort of launched into Norman Fairclough for daring to just concentrate on linguistic analysis because he was a social linguistic academic and didn't look at the wider context. Check that out if you're interested. There's a need to go beyond the text, so I'm not slagging off linguistics, I'm just saying we need to go beyond the text to research the power relations through which texts are shaped, consumed and represented, the cycle of mediation which must include, in the case of news, a focus upon news sources and political actors, newsroom dynamics and the practices of journalists, the material and ideological conditions in which news is received, and the new digital technologies through which information can be remediated or represented. Only a few contemporary scholars appear interested in returning to the kind of sociology of media and politics that Gramsci anticipates in his discussion of tactics and strategies in a war of position. Egan is one exception, but he's an American Stalinist, so it's not a very good example. This paper is particularly interested in the role of neoliberal think tanks, not just in terms of their contributions as news sources, but also in terms of a wider focus on their work in seeking to intervene more broadly in news-related cultural fields. This may be the more important dimension for understanding their real significance. To what extent they help to make the political weather, which influences not just the copy that a journalist might write for a specific news report, but more importantly helps to form the bedrock assumptions or common sense that informs the thinking of individual journalists, the composition of punditry panels, the editorial decision-making of broadcast affairs shows, the strategy of news managers inside organisations like the BBC, and ultimately the echelons of senior executives, technocrats, owners and governors of our key media and cultural institutions. In other words, today's neoliberal think tanks exemplify many of the strategies and tactics that Gramsci would call a war of position. And this is where a return to Gramsci is useful, because his writing on hegemony and ideology encourages us to think about the sociology of political and ideological mobilisation with a framework that not only acknowledges the importance of class structure, but also the complexity of alliances involving activists, social groups and institutions, all engaged in promoting ideas that come to form ideology. Gramsci tells us to recognise the importance of ideological movement and counter-movement in the struggle to secure ideas, to note that such movements usually involve dynamic but unstable alliances between social groups and institutions, within and across classes, and to note the way in which certain campaigns or concepts can be appropriated, repurposed or hijacked by social groups in struggle. This is all part of the process through which, as Chantal Mouffe noted, Gramsci suggests that social groups come to see their corporate or sectional interests as socially necessary or as universal ways of understanding that go beyond the economic to embrace complete moral and political prescriptions for what should be done. When corporate, class or sectional that is, interests come to be embraced as universal, the hegemonic moment arrives. Now, not every think tank director has read Gramsci, but think tanks can be very much understood as a Gramscian phenomena. Some think tanks may explicitly describe their ambitions in quite modest terms, to promote certain ideas or prescriptions in particular fields of policy, or to generate research to illuminate public choices. However, wherever situated on the political spectrum, they will draw ideological nourishment from deeper roots, and this will inform an implicit or explicit view of the world. They will necessarily have connections to sources of economic funding that are associated with particular power relationships, and these in turn are likely to be contested and challenged by other forces. So check out the funding of various, particularly the right-of-centre neoliberal think tanks, and much of their money comes from companies involved in things like private security, the marketisation of the health service, oil, etc., etc. Most importantly, think tanks have to devise strategies for building alliances between different groups in support of their ideas, and this may involve reaching out not only to political parties, but beyond these to secure the alignment of intellectuals in different fields, opinion formers, academics, community or institutional leaders, journalists and feature writers, cultural commentators and so on. Their task is to universalise a sectional understanding of the world and to reinterpret alternative visions so as to neutralise their threat. Here's an example. Mark Littlewood, again. Here he is reviewing I, Daniel Blake. I don't know if you've seen I, Daniel Blake. I'm not sure everybody would agree with Mark Littlewood's reading. One of the best free market libertarian critiques of our bloated welfare state, he says. Other people, as you can see here, read it rather differently. He's writing in The Observer. Here's an intervention. It's a classic new IEA intervention into a wider cultural realm. They don't just want to influence political, narrowly defined party political discourse. They've got a much broader cultural agenda. So that begs a question. You know, what is a neoliberal think tank? What's neoliberalism? Why hasn't neoliberalism died given the financial crash, given the rise of authoritarian populist politics, etc.? So the concern of this paper is with neoliberal think tanks and their ideological work, but this begs two related questions. Firstly, what actually is neoliberalism? And secondly, is it in the light of the recent lurch towards authoritarian, populist and protectionist politics in the US, UK, Turkey, Hungary, most of Western Europe, etc., a spent force that no longer warrants much academic attention? There is a range of definitions and approaches to neoliberalism, some of which are actually complementary rather than contradictory. Actually, most of them are probably complementary. Each has implications for how we approach the strategies of neoliberal think tanks. What we expect neoliberal think tanks to do depends upon what we think they are in the first place. So for followers of Foucault, neoliberal discourses function to create the neoliberal subject in the modern world. So that's people like William Davis and Nick Rose and others. In other words, neoliberalism is defined and understood through its regulatory effect upon us as subjects who can only exist within and through social relations of marketisation and commodification. Through this lens, we might expect neoliberal think tanks to be ambitious in their attempts to reach out beyond the fields of pure economic or social policy, but to insert themselves into discussions of everyday life, moral and ethical decision-making, health, the body, etc., and to encourage us to accordingly regulate our expectations of other institutions, particularly those providing public services. William Davis puts this very well in defining neoliberalism, quote, in a way, this is almost the best definition I've come across, neoliberalism as, quote, the pursuit of the disenchantment of politics by economics. In other words, no, we can't do that, it's too expensive. You can only engage with that service as a consumer. It's by far the most efficient way of doing things, etc. Colin Crouch approaches neoliberalism as specifically the expression of corporate power. From this perspective, neoliberalism is the fundamental preference for the market over the state, quote. But in contrast to Davis, he also argues that, quote, actually existing as opposed to ideologically pure neoliberalism is nothing like as committed to free markets as is claimed. It is a pragmatic political project intended to place more or less all institutions in society, universities, hospitals, charities, under the obligation to behave as if they are business corporations. But the actual arguments and ideological positions employed to do this will vary from situation to situation. From this perspective, we should not expect neoliberal think tanks to necessarily offer coherent or consistent intellectual positions. Instead, they are simply more likely to be, quote, corporate friendly in their arguments. So that's corporatists like Crouch. A third position is to understand neoliberalism in terms that draw upon Marxist and neo-Marxist political economies. For example, Miroski defines neoliberalism by what it is not. It's neither a reaffirmation of Victorian liberal laissez-faire politics nor neoclassical economics. For Miroski, neoliberalism is primarily a strategy for ensuring the continuing primacy of financial capital in the face of all the evidence of the disastrous consequences of 3 decades of financialisation. Miroski emphasises the continuing dominance of what he calls the NTC, the neoliberal thought collective, entrenched in university economics departments, the boardrooms of banks, departments of state, and of course influential Anglo-American think tanks. For him, it's not about the coherence of intellectual frameworks, but the invisibility of power, because neoliberalism is, quote, ideology of no ideology. So if we follow Miroski, we need to be concerned with the networking strategies of neoliberal think tanks, the sets of relationships they seek to establish and sustain, particularly within the academy and government. But there are differences between Marxist-inspired readings. Stuart Hall concurs with Miroski and Crouch in stressing the adaptability and malleability of neoliberalism. It becomes rather different things at different historical moments. I'll edit this bit, but basically Hall includes as neoliberal everything from Gladstone's approach to liberal government in the late 19th century through the rise of Thatcher into the period of New Labour managerialism. And for him, they're all different variants of neoliberalism. In contrast, Harvey is in agreement regarding the main features of neoliberalism as a hegemonic discourse, but wants to locate it much more specifically as a class response to the crisis of accumulation capitalism experienced as the Keynesian post-war settlement collapsed. From Harvey and Gramsci, we might take away the point that neoliberal think tanks may be expected not only to promote certain ideas and policies, but also to engage in strategies of active aggression, seeking to undermine and discredit institutions and ideas that may be regarded by them as obstacles to neoliberal hegemony at particular moments in history. So I think that's one of the things that's interesting about going back to Gramsci, to focus on that way in which there is a war of position where not only certain ideas are promoted, but there's an active attempt to discredit ideas and the institutions those ideas are associated with. So this is a bit I'll skip. The history of think tanks is interesting. You can read it in terms of maybe three phases. Everybody knows about the beginnings of the Mont Pelerin Society, the meeting between the Swiss bankers and Hayek, and how that then fed into the development of the Institute for Economic Affairs in the 50s, along with some other organisations like the Economic League that started the first blacklist of union activists, Aims for Industry, etc. And then there's a second phase in the 70s and 80s with the rise of Mrs. Thatcher. The Institute for Economic Affairs is still going strong at that stage, and then other think tanks bubble up as well, stimulated literally by Mrs. Thatcher in some ways, the Adam Smith Institute, Centre for Policy Studies. And then by the early 2000s, these think tanks are beginning to flag a bit. The IEA has lost some steam, but there's a new project to re-energise the Conservative Party after it lost the 97 election, and then a third phase of think tanks bubble up. Not all of them neoliberal necessarily, but a majority probably. So that's kind of skipping that bit. I'll get rid of that. But it might be worth just picking up the very, very recent history. You may begin to get the impression that I'm slightly obsessed with Mark Littlewood. It's probably true. Now, Littlewood takes over the Institute for Economic Affairs as the new Director General in 2007, and he announces a new approach. The Institute had kind of run out of steam, and Littlewood begins to outline his new strategy. So I'll pick this paper up here. Think tanks that emerged in this third wave were all characterised by a more intense competitive desire to secure media opportunities, and all prioritised news media work as a core activity. This was partly because in the era of New Labour politics, the research departments of unions and the TUC, the Fabian Society and other traditional policy groups within the labour movement, all of whom had historically served as important sources of ideas and policy for the old Labour Party, had been supplanted by a set of new centre-left or Blairite think tanks, including Demos and the IPPR. This meant that the third wave of neoliberal think tanks entered a more crowded field in the early 2000s. The very recent history of the IEA is interesting. Lord Harris, following advice from Hayek, always wanted to avoid the IEA coming to be seen as an extension of any particular political party. So they've always fought against being associated just directly with the Conservatives. And this is actually a classic instance of Gramscian positioning, keeping the political options open whilst maintaining clear sight of the ideological objectives. With the passing of Lord Harris and Sir Anthony Fisher, the IEA was widely regarded as having lost its way in the post-Thatcher 90s. Under the direction of Graham Mather, it had become a vehicle for promoting the career of Graham Mather. However, a new Director General, Mark Littlewood, was appointed in 2007. Littlewood had previously worked for Liberty, and then after Liberty as the media officer for the Liberal Democrats. So he wasn't a Conservative. He was not a Conservative, but he was a frequent participant at events organised by the Libertarian Alliance. And at one of these events, he outlined a new strategy for the IEA in classical Gramscian terms. We need our people everywhere, he said. In particular, there was a new priority in recultivating relationships within the academy, universities, not just in economics departments, but anywhere where the IEA ideas might be fruitfully injected. Secondly, he announced that the IEA would pursue a much more aggressive media strategy, one that would look for opportunities for the IEA to contribute not just to the discussion of economic policy, but to any discussion about ways to, quote, improve understanding of the fundamental institutions of a free society. Currently, the IEA is running the Paragon Initiative, which is a very well-funded 5-year research project that will identify the areas of government activity that can be put back in the hands of individuals, families, civil society, local government, charities and the market. That's 2017. You might think that huge areas have already been handed back to the market, but the IEA is convinced there's a lot more to do. Similarly, the Taxpayers Alliance has accelerated its media work in recent years. It was founded by Matthew Elliott, who is a trustee of the Social Affairs Unit, which represents an extension of the IEA into the field of social policy. Elliott is a professional political lobbyist and chief executive of the Vote Leave campaign. However, in recent years, the front person for the Taxpayers Alliance is Thier down there, who is currently political director at the TPA, but was formerly Deputy Director at the Freedom Association, a right-wing libertarian fringe organisation. Chakravarti is also an extremely effective media performer who is very comfortable engaging in hegemonic struggle in the broadcasting studio. So, she's got a very similar strategy, although they're not quite so focused on the academy as the IEA is. And her media skills may be partly because she's also a professional singer. That's her other job. She's Bangladeshi and she does traditional Bangladeshi singing. So, right, now for the empirical stuff. So, what this paper is actually supposed to be reporting is some empirical research which I've been undertaking. And as you can see here, there are 3 measures which I've been using to try and think through how you can research, how can you operationalise a hypothesis around the hegemonic work of neoliberal think tanks like the IEA. So my original idea for exploring the work of these think tanks was prompted by George Monbiot in a Guardian feature. He raised the usual concerns of the left about the profusion of neoliberal right-of-centre think tanks, their agendas concerned with promoting corporate interests, privatisations, marketisations, etc. But then he made an interesting observation, which was that frequently in news reporting, and he identifies the BBC as particularly culpable, the political nature of right-wing think tanks was often not acknowledged or made explicit in news reporting. They'd managed to weave their way into the fabric of news reporting with an ideological influence that was often not acknowledged or made explicit. There's some published research on the effectiveness of right-wing think tanks as sources of news in the US and Australia. But the role of neoliberal think tanks as sources of news in the UK has been given surprisingly little attention. There's some literature on the extent to which news reporting, particularly of the post-2008 financial crisis, has tended to embrace neoliberal assumptions and frames for explanation. So there's Berry at Cardiff, Corley looking at Ireland, and I published a paper on the reasons why financial journalists didn't spot the crisis coming. And we've also now got a new study of the BBC as a key media institution that's been profoundly shaped in recent years by neoliberal values. And we had Tom Mills talking about that a couple of weeks back. But there's little yet in the way of research that assesses the media interventions that these think tanks make through mainstream media. And what I'm trying to do here is to think of ways in which we could do that. So first of all, the quantitative and qualitative data on BBC News broadcasts. This data was gathered partly through the use of a RAP student, and I don't think it's the most robust data that we're necessarily going to get, and I'm not sure whether I'd put this into a paper for peer review. So things like sort of checking the intercoder reliability, stuff like that, a little bit of a problem. What comes out of it actually is in some ways almost not quite a nil hypothesis, but what we've got along the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, those are months. So 1 is January, 12 is December. Going up the side, we have appearances of think tanks in the BBC 10 o'clock news across 2015. And as you can see, actually there's not that many. which makes me think maybe the data's a little bit dodgy. The thing that does emerge, here's Newsnight. So we did the news at 10 and we did Newsnight in exactly the same way, literally just counting the appearance of think tanks in these broadcasts. The source is Bob, Box of Broadcasts, and that in itself is problematic because Bob doesn't necessarily represent a representative sample of everything that's going through. I mean, it has to be said, almost every news bulletin and Newsnight edition is recorded by some academic across the country, but not all of them. So there are problems there. But what we might say from that is that it's actually, although the Taxpayers Alliance and the Institute for Economic Affairs do make, several appearances, the one that absolutely dominates is, tends to be the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which has become a kind of arbiter for journalists, a handy way of going to the Delphic Oracle to get a pronouncement on what's going on in terms of the economy.
Always referred to as independent rather than centrist.
Yeah. And there's a debate to be had about whether it's not neoliberal or whether actually in some ways it is neoliberal, but we didn't count it as neoliberal. But anyway, I'm not so confident of that data. So here's the second measure. The other thing I began to think about was ways in which you could get at the assumptions which journalists make about the world, their inferential frameworks, and whether you could use the people they follow on Twitter as a sort of proxy measure which maps their inferential framework, their way of seeing the world. And this is a very crude measure. In a way, it's very oversimplistic. But I took Francis O'Grady, who's TUC General Secretary, as a comparator. And I took Mark Littlewood. So here's Francis O'Grady. Here's Mark Littlewood. And I looked at who followed them on Twitter. It's a bit fiddly. One of the interesting things about the research was that you can get any number of apps to measure how you are doing on Twitter. But it's very difficult to find an app that will allow you to extract data on how other people are doing or their relation. That's much harder. But in the end, Marcus suggested an app which I used. And I was able to sort of print out all the journalists and other media people who were following Francis O'Grady and Mark Littlewood. And as you can see, when it comes to the BBC, there is a huge difference. So with Francis O'Grady, all the people who you might expect to follow her were following her. So, there were chief political correspondents. Let's get back to the paper and I'll give you a bit more detail on that. Yeah. That includes Carmel Ahmed, who's the chief business and economics correspondent, Chris Mason, Carol Walker, Norman Smith, all the political correspondents at the BBC. Shows like BBC Question Time, BBC The Big Question, will follow Francis. Actually, no, they won't follow Francis O'Grady. So the main political and financial correspondents follow Francis O'Grady, but they don't. But those following Mark Littlewood are vaster in number. So that includes all the people I've just mentioned, plus BBC Question Time, BBC The Big Question, which is the Nicky Campbell thing on Sundays, the BBC Daily and Sunday Politics, BBC Breakfast, BBC Andrew Marr, BBC Radio 5, BBC Radio World, BBC Radio 4 World Tonight, BBC Radio Any Questions, BBC Radio Free Thinking, BBC On the Money. All those are following Mark Littlewood. In other words, Littlewood has managed to attract the attention of the producers and makers, not just of political news, but current affairs and more general ethical discussion shows. The producers of these shows follow his Twitter feed, presumably not only for his reaction to key issues, but also for ideas about issues to develop shows around. Through Twitter, he has access to current affairs programme makers' agendas. Francis O'Grady is followed by some important BBC correspondents, including Nick Watt, John Pienaar, Georgina Patterson, Henry Tribe, who produces Peston on Sunday for ITV. But the difference in breadth is notable. One caveat, the BBC just have an enormous number of people involved in the production of political broadcasting, because we're looking not just at national political broadcasting, but all the regions and all the local stations as well, BBC Scotland, BBC North, BBC South, etc. So, that skews the data to an extent. Anyway, the final piece of data comes from an analysis of two extremely strategically important BBC current affairs and news shows. These are Question Time, which is broadcast on BBC One, and Any Questions, which is the older BBC Radio 4 equivalent. Table 3 reports the appearance of representatives of think tanks as guests on these shows during the last 5 years, from February 2012 through to February 2017. So I've gone back 5 years. And if I get a research grant from the Economic and Social Research Council, I might go back another 5 years, possibly. We've got right-of-centre think tanks, left-of-centre think tanks, and others. And again, I thought a useful comparator was unions. So, I'm using unions both with that second measure and this third measure as a way of thinking through, an alternative universe, a universe where just under 9 million people who go to work and are in unions are somehow sort of represented in current affairs discussion shows. So here we go. Over the last 5 years, there have been 16 shows with neoliberal think tank representatives on Question Time. Mark Littlewood has gobbled up a big chunk of those. Absolutely no sign of any left-of-centre think tanks like the IPPR or CLASS, Centre for Labour and Social Studies, those sorts of think tanks. Some other odd ones like the Gwilym Foundation and the Institute for Ideas, the slightly mad think tank, but unions, 7 bods. Any questions? Slightly different in that there are 12 appearances by right-of-centre think tanks and 9 union appearances. But nonetheless, there's further evidence here that neoliberal think tanks are very good at getting their people onto these shows. They've prioritised these shows. If you look at their YouTube channels, you'll see there are lots and lots of clips of their people on these shows performing because they see them as strategically important. Right, so I think I'll probably wind up there. Conclusions then. BBC Question Time particularly has proved sort of a fruitful terrain for neoliberal think tanks, particularly the Institute for Economic Ideas. Political journalists and others all involved in the production of broadcasting and political television factor in the IEA into their map of the world. It's part of their inferential frameworks that they use to sort of make sense of and understand and sort out key issues in the world. The IEA aims to put our people everywhere. That means not just in television studios, but everywhere. Reviewing films for The Observer, into academic departments, not just economic departments, but who knows, the Faculty of Arts at the University of Winchester, perhaps. And also, they are seeking to delegitimate other institutions. That's part of their work. So just the other week, I came across this.
The right wing. Now, well, not so many, according to
this is the Today programme.
The free market think tank that has been doing a bit of research on the subject, and Ben Southwood, their head of research, is here, and on the line, Professor David Phoenix, who is the Vice Chancellor of South Bank University in London. Morning to you both.
Good morning.
Ben Southwood, first of all, what do you think you've discovered?
Sound like a frog.
So what we looked at was various surveys of political party support among academics. and over time. And we found that about 12% of them support Conservatives or UKIP, and about 87% of them support Labour, the Greens, or Lib Dems. And then we compared to population support for those parties, which is about 50-50 for the right-wing and Conservative parties, and about 50-50 for the left-wing and Liberal parties. And so we're wondering what's the explanation. And so one explanation that people have put forward is that academics are smarter than the population at large. Obviously they need to be some of the smartest people to be academics, and smarter people support left-wing and Liberal parties. So we looked at, within the top 5% of intelligence, what people tended to support, and it was more like the population at large and not like academics. So it suggested that intelligence is not the thing that explains why academics support left-wing and Liberal parties. So then we looked into possible other explanations. And so one might be that academics have this trait, openness to experience, that psychologists think that might explain certain behaviours. That's one possible. Another possible is that hiring and firing is biased in some way. And we didn't in the paper find evidence of this, although we weren't looking for it. We were looking about the IQ question. That's one other explanation. Another is that there's sort of a social pressure to conform among academics. But we weren't really looking at why, except for to see if this was the explanation, but more like what the costs of this could be.
But David, before we get on to that, David Phoenix, do you accept that the broad finding that there aren't very many Conservative or UKIP supporters among university academics is probably right?
I had a quick look through the report, and I don't know whether I can agree with that based on the data for two reasons.
And so it goes on, and in some ways this chap Ben Southwood gets torn to pieces, but that doesn't really matter, because what they're doing, it's a stupid piece of research, but what they're doing is just placing the idea in the public domain, and then it's followed up with the usual sort of opinion formers that you might expect, like Charles Moore, who writes editorial pieces, comment pieces for right-wing papers, and the very next Sunday, that was midweek on the Today programme. If you're not familiar with the Radio 4 Today programme, it's strategically important because journalists all around the country, local and regional reporters and journalists who are thinking about the news agenda for that day in the local area, will all listen to the Today programme to get ideas. So, and the IEA know this, so they will target the Today programme simply to float a theme, and then it's picked up and reinforced a few days later by opinion leaders, in quotation marks, like Charles Moore. So that was a classic bit of sort of the war of position, I would argue. And I'll finish with that. And watch out for the IEA round our faculty.